Hello everyone, my name is Haseeb Khan and I am the Director of Innovation and Technology at Tkxel. And today with me is August, who is an expert with open source innovation. Hey August, thanks for taking our time to speak with us today.
Hi, hello. Absolutely lovely to be here.
Right. So before we dive into the topic and the details of open source innovation and how to go about it, it would be great if you can give a quick introduction about yourself, Canonical, and what you do there, what's your role, what initiatives are you involved in, and I mean a general summary.
Sure. So as you mentioned, my name is August. I work as a cloud and data center technology sales specialist at Canonical, which is the company behind Ubuntu. So you can kind of think of it as the Microsoft Windows relationship. So
Yeah.
the Microsoft is behind Windows the same way as Canonical is behind Ubuntu. And so Ubuntu is the third most used operating system right now out there in the world, right after Windows and Mac OS. And it is the most popular Linux operating system.
Right.
And then Canonical, as a company, work with deployment, support, and management of OpenStack private clouds and Kubernetes. So we were actually one of the development partners together with Google to develop Kubernetes.
Right.
And we also support companies in managing their data centers, taking IoT and edge projects to production, and many other things. But I'm sure we will discuss it all.
Sure. So Ubuntu, I believe when I started with Ubuntu, it was called Linux for Human Beings. That was the slogan back in the day. I'm not sure if that is still the case, but I mean, I was one of the, early adapters of there as well. And I figured that among all the other, desktop-based platforms, that was Genome, one was like KDE, Ubuntu was sort of like more familiar and more human as per se. And besides Ubuntu, we actually use, Ubuntu in a lot of day-to-day tasks as well as deployments that we do at Tkxel. So, I mean, in a nutshell, if you talk about what, in your opinion, is open source innovation? So we know that, I mean, it is like innovating something, but what exactly? How would you frame it?
Right. So open source usually refers to that kind of software that uses an open development process and has the original source code, which is made absolutely freely available and can be distributed and modified according to anyone using it. And so just like you mentioned before, this Ubuntu slogan, Ubuntu is actually a South African word. It comes from South Africa. And so that's exactly what it means, right? So like by humans to other humans. So it has that whole notion of it's open source. So an example of an open source would be, any kind of Linux operating systems out there, which are open source, just like Ubuntu is. And anyone can download it and use it for free, as well as modify it and contribute to it. So at the moment, there are almost 500 different Linux distributions in an active development. However, Ubuntu has the biggest and the strongest community of users around it, as well as enterprise support. So I meet a lot of Ubuntu users and even fans who have used Ubuntu since years ago and really, really like it and support that idea of open sharing. And just to give you some other examples of open source innovations, that could be projects like OpenStack, Kubernetes, TensorFlow, Ceph, Kafka, Grafana. These are just some very widely used open source innovations and
Right. That's, that's a wonderful sort of summary. But I mean, these days, what we have like learned with the environment around us is that a lot of organizations are basically embracing or I mean deploying open source technology at a very rapid pace. So I mean, back in the day, people were sort of more bound or more comfortable with closed source systems. But now, as we are seeing in the enterprises, startups everywhere, the adaptation of open source technology is getting, I mean, very fast. I mean, they are adapted on a very fast pace. So, what do you think is the prime reason behind it?
That's a very good question. Yeah, definitely companies are deploying these innovations at a rapid pace. And to put it in a very simple way, it's because it gives them the flexibility, reliability, and security without compromising on the cost.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I would say at the moment there are two types of companies these days out there. At least that's what I kind of feel from my experience. The ones that actually embrace open source and understands the whole full benefits and value of it. And the ones, and this is a very minority of companies who still look at it a little bit skeptically, as in, it's more for like desktops and more for development. But the fact is that these days, open source and Linux is completely enterprise ready.
Right. Uh, so, I mean, going open source, people say that it it was inevitable. I mean, one would actually have to open source. And without naming any companies, what we have seen in the past that people who were sort of writing open letters to the open source community, ultimately the organizations basically opened up their stacks and shared the source code with the world to have it and then build it and deploy it on whatever architecture or hardware they like. So why do you think it became inevitable? Why they had to do that?
I guess for the same reasons, because of the benefits that it brought. I believe that it was like absolutely inevitable because developers needed that space and these tools to create freely
Mm-hmm.
because the technology was developing and evolving and progressing so fast that I think it could not have been built on only proprietary softwares. So actually back in 2001, this former Microsoft CEO, Steve Ballmer,
Yeah.
famously called Linux a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches.
Yeah.
And I can say with confidence that Microsoft has a very different attitude to open
Right
source
now.
today, right? So
So
around, yeah.
I believe the famous logo Microsoft Love Linux that broke the ice everywhere.
That's
So
very true.
yeah,
And
yeah,
in these days, we have a very close and very strong relationship with Microsoft because around 75% of all Linux instances in Microsoft Azure cloud actually runs on Ubuntu. So we
yeah,
have very good close relationship on that.
yeah, you bet. So also, if we talk about emerging technology, especially in the 5G space, so do you think, I mean, using open source will enable companies to have this particular thing adapted at a frequent pace, or how would it reshape the telecom industry overall, in your opinion?
The telecom industry is a very interesting use case.
Mhm.
I would say it already has reshaped telco industry in a major way. Telcos are using open source cloud technologies to virtualize their networks, right?
Right.
So historically, telco networks have been very expensive and hardware based.
Mhm.
Now, all of their functions have been brought to the cloud, and
Virtual.
cloud for telcos brought this fundamental evolution in the way that networks are built and then run and managed.
Mm-hmm.
So this, the virtualized infrastructure gave the foundation for a technology like 5G, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
So I believe we took up quite a lot of bigger names in the discussion that we just had. It was mentioned of Mac OS, Apple, then Windows, Microsoft, Canonical itself. Then we can talk about like others like Red Hat, SUSE, Fedora, IBM, Oracle.
Yeah.
All of these have like something related to open source or Linux in their stack somehow in the overall offering, right? So, do you think that it's easier for larger corporations to spend more, of their budget into open source innovations as compared to smaller startups? Because what we have learned from the past is that frameworks like Django, Python Django, basically came out of another implementation that was called EveryBlock. So Django is a spin-off of EveryBlock, you can say, and EveryBlock was a startup company. So they basically took that initiative and deployed that. So in your opinion, does it matter that smaller startups probably are shy in uh, deploying their resources on open source innovation, or corporates, do that more or they do less, or vice versa? How have you seen it happening, and what's your take on that?
I would say that it's sometimes even easier for small companies to go open source way. Look, every company was once small with not that much resources.
Right.
And as I mentioned, open source and Ubuntu, for example, is all about giving that ability for any developer, any startup, any small enterprise to create something, to make their idea a reality. And they do that using the same OS as some of the biggest banks in the world that, for example, Canonical works with. So that's where I think it's that kind of magic of open source. Like, for example, I want to guess that, in the past couple of weeks, all of us have probably used, for example, Uber, for example, Netflix, or Instagram.
Right.
All of these started on Ubuntu.
Right.
And so none of those would, might not be possible today if not that technology and open source infrastructure that allowed them to develop these things that now pretty much changes our lives, right? So I would say that those developers that actually really love Ubuntu and they learn how to program and work on these operating systems, they go on and they start startups on the very same open source infrastructures. Yep. However, the situation might be a little bit different for someone like, biggest telcos that we work with these days, like BT or AT&T, Deutsche Telekom, Tele2. We work with all of those telcos with, enabling their 5G and creating this space for innovation. So right. I think it really depends with open source which stage of a development and kind of evolving within your IT infrastructure your company is. It depends if it's harder for you or if it's just a very natural decision to go with open source.
Right. So, and also, in these days when sort of people, instead of like large, structures, large hierarchies within the organizations, people are sort of mostly operating in flat teams. Organizations are inculcating like flat structure in their, overall mix as compared to building like, top hills like this. So, in your opinion, how leaders and managers can sort of, formulate this culture within their teams for open source innovation. Especially, we in the company, we always say that, I mean, seeing good code, how people have uh, actually developed it, is a like a blessing, and it offers a very good learning, because you see how others are structuring their code, and that code is also seen by a lot of other smart people who have actually pinpointed smaller things here and there, because devil is in the detail, as we say. So they pick things and then they comment on that, and then there's a whole cycle in which the code gets included, and then in the end we say that none of us is as smart as all of us, right? So so how leaders or managers can actually incorporate such culture of open source innovation within their teams if they are working on an open source stack?
I think it's all about, just like I guess with anything, it's about the continuous learning, improvement, and raising your awareness of technologies and opportunities out there, right? So technology in general is changing so fast, and it's the same with open source innovations. Now, there has to be this balance in every company between, constantly innovating on your IT infrastructure, which is important, but then you also need to have a major focus on, actually developing the business applications, actually creating, focusing on what really matters to the business. So
Right.
this is one of the things that our CDO Mark Shuttleworth always kind of emphasized. When it comes to IT infrastructure, everyone wants that infrastructure just to work, and you want to kind of forget about it. You just want it to work, to be there, to be reliable, to be secure, and so that is where, still to this day, a lot of companies kind of battle, because it does take a lot of time to look after your IT infrastructure and to keep up with all the new technologies that are coming in, like private clouds and then multi-cloud strategies. And then you also have something on premise. And how do you make all of that work together? So, even at Canonical, we are always developing tools for developers to always experiment with these technologies. Because in the company, if developers or DevOps itself, they start to, they're getting their hands on technology, they start to get to know it, they start to feel more comfortable, they feel which technologies would be a game changer, which
Right.
technologies would be a really, really good idea to bring into the company. And so I think when it comes to like managers and leaders of these companies, I think it's giving their teams that freedom to explore and experiment. That's what IT is in a lot of cases about. Like, it's exciting. There's so many new things that you could discover. So
Right.
I think if you do that, then you could easily find that, with these new open source technologies, you could be more efficient and your workloads could be way easier managed and secure.
Right. So from a business or a management perspective, if for example, one of our listeners is a CEO or a head of a business unit, and their business is like doing really, really well, then many times people are sort of resistant to change. They don't want to sort of participate or innovate because everything is going fine. So what are some of the arguments that you would make to convince such people to employ some of their resources into this open source innovation and be a part of the community and the team?
Good question. That's something that definitely a question that I get for sure. And it's great if you feel like you have everything in control and that your IT infrastructure and the strategy you have right now is working for you. However, you have to look ahead. You
Mm-hmm.
have to look 5 years, 10 years from now. What is going to be relevant? What is going to be dominating, IT infrastructures of the most successful enterprises? So it's
Mm-hmm.
something really, really important to have that open mind, and to experiment and to try deploy and just be open for the benefits that open source innovation could bring you. So I would simply say, if someone is kind of closed in the way that they are doing things right now, it's very likely that they are going to simply stay behind.
Yeah. So they will basically not be upgrading themselves and catching up with the world of technology, right?
Exactly. So it might be working now, but not necessarily in the long term.
Right, right, right. So we have also seen and have read and heard a lot about the role of Ubuntu on edge computing and IoT in general. Like, for example, people are, in what I have seen, is deploying a lot of Ubuntu based, distros or other things on their Raspberry Pis, or, smaller hardware, self contained computers and whatnot. So, how do you see that reshaping the overall edge and IT industry, and what's the role of Ubuntu and Canonical in there?
Yeah, we work quite a lot with these projects, and Ubuntu and Canonical, I think, brings most value when you are having thousands of devices that you need to scale and manage and patch and upgrade over the air, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have something called Ubuntu Core, which is an Ubuntu distribution, a version of Ubuntu dedicated for IoT and the edge.
Okay.
And so because of his like modular architecture and this technology called snaps,
Mm-hmm.
um, it is very, very lightweight, extremely secure, and transactional. So you can
Oh.
easily update, upgrade, roll out, upgrades, patches, roll back if you need to. And we've seen a lot of projects over a number of verticals and industries. So robotics have definitely been a big one these days. Some of the biggest drone companies in the world are based on Ubuntu, like DJI or Parrot. So drones is definitely a big one. Automotive, like
Mm-hmm.
self-driving cars technologies and any kind of industrial gateways. We work on many edge projects with telcos as well. It's been an important part. Digital signage is one of those as well.
Right, right,
So,
right.
so IoT is definitely getting really, really lively through all kind of industries. And these just a couple of mentions. Of course, there's more verticals, but it's extremely exciting technologies because so many devices are going into production every single year.
Right. So, these days when we talk about data, the most, important or the most critical or the first thing that came to mind is security, data privacy, security, GDPR. All these sort of privacy policies, use of cookies and whatnot. All of these basically things pop up into the mind at a first step. So, Linux in general, do you think is like, especially for Ubuntu, do you think that it's secure enough to actually run Linux on the edge? Is it like, okay, is it secure? Can users be, feeling the freedom in their mind and be sure that they are secure, their data is secure, there are no breaches and things like that?
Yeah. You know what? Ubuntu Core is probably the safest choice that you could make. And it's mostly because of this snaps technology that I told about. It just packages your applications in a way that is extremely secure. It's an only read file, so no one external, even if device is at the edge, even if OS is running at the edge, no one can actually access it or edit it in any kind of way. So
Right.
it's actually one of the most secure ways to run at the edge. And generally, not even Ubuntu core, Ubuntu has been recognized as the most secure operating system out there.
Right. Right.
Because of the tooling I use for patching and upgrading it. So it's just one of those big misconceptions that some enterprises have on kind of security aspects of Linux and open source. But
Right.
even like all these certifications, that is something that we can provide. And that is why we work with a lot of banks and telcos and governmental institutions, because security and compliance is extremely important for them. And the big message is that Ubuntu and Ubuntu Core is enterprise ready and can completely fully bring that security and compliance.
Right. 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 So, because I was just asking, because the many people have a misconception that, I mean, anything of which you can get access to the source code, I mean, really you can do anything with that. So that actually gives the impression. But yeah, I believe it's great that you have clarified it somehow. So so we discussed some technology stacks like Kubernetes, like OpenStack, Ubuntu Core for IoT. So do you think or do you see enterprises adapting these technologies more in the future to maintain and run their IT infrastructure? What's your take on that?
Answer would be yes.
Mm-hmm.
I even like these days, I notice a lot of enterprises and a lot of companies that want to implement these technologies, but not necessarily have resources or not necessarily have the knowledge or time to implement these technologies. And that's something that we work with as well with Canonical. We do all kind of a support and managed services for companies just that wants to kind of write the benefits of those technologies, but don't necessarily want to manage those themselves. So I see a lot of demand for these technologies, and I think companies are starting to more and more see that these technologies that are coming, like OpenStack and Kubernetes, the ones that are already there, now those are inevitable. And those will, take over their data centers. And a lot of people are still using, public clouds like Google, Azure, AWS. And in many, many cases, they are using Ubuntu on those public clouds because
Mm-hmm.
that is an OS that they're really, really comfortable and familiar with. And then they can run Canonical strong Kubernetes on top of that. So there are a lot of very different ways on how to use these technologies. So,
Right.
These days we have a lot of conversations about the effectiveness of multi-clouds and hybrid clouds and how to make that work for you. So I think that those technologies are kind of, in a sense, getting more and more complex.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I believe that there will be more and more technologies that helps with that complexity and makes it simple.
Yep, yep, that's helpful. So with this, I will wrap up the session for today, August. It was very nice having you here, and thanks for providing us with some insights in the open source innovation and open source Ubuntu Canonical in general. So I look forward to host you again on Better Tech with another podcast on some different topic. Until then, I would like to thank you for your time and the opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks for having me. It was really lovely. Always nice to share these technologies.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.